The sixth way language maps to reality is, quote, a general concept is the intellectual apprehension of essence. So the word general is rooted in gene or genus, which refers to an entire class of things or persons. Okay? The word concept is comprised of con, meaning with, and the word sept from the Proto-Indo-European root kop, which means to grasp, right? To grasp with. So it's really a grasping. A general concept is the grasping of essence. It's the intellectual apprehension. So to intellectually apprehend something means to grasp with your mind the essence of something. And the essence, of course, is knowing what something is in comparison to something else. That essence could be a concept. The essence could be an animal. Could be just something in objective reality. Okay? This way language maps to reality is relied upon very heavily, to the point where the actual landscape of the world is often confused with the map. In other words, the objective, nameless reality that exists is far too often confused with concepts, ideas, notions, and language that we generate from our minds, right? So I know I've talked about this before in this series, but it's important to reiterate this, and it's important to understand that if we're laying a general concept over our world, if we're putting this layer of language between us and objective reality, we're not sensing, or we're not really tuning in as fully to reality as we possibly can, right? So the sixth way that language is mapping to reality is relied on very heavily, right? General concepts. People think in general concepts, general ideas. It's where a lot of misjudging our reality comes in, right? This intellectual apprehension, the mind is trying to grasp what something is, right? And we can only know what something is by comparing it to something else, right? So it's a very slippery notion, and it's one of the classic intellectual traps of thinking that we can fall into when we're talking about what it means to really interpret, or what it means to observe our reality as close to the real rawness of reality as we can, instead of just generating labels and putting them over top of things. So the seventh way language maps to reality is, quote, an empirical concept is the indirect intellectual apprehension of an individual. The intellect can know individual objects only indirectly in the phantasms. Remember, a phantasm is something it's a mental image in the absence of the thing really in front of you. So you're imagining, let's say, you're imagining a red car. There's no red car in front of you. You're just imagining this car and it's red. That's a phantasm, right? Because individuals are material, with one exception, the intellect itself. Because it is a spiritual individual, the intellect can know itself directly and reflexively. So what this is saying is that you can know the intellect, your intellect can know individual objects. And individual objects, it could be anything, a person, something that was created, something in nature, whatever, a stone, a car, a person, tree, whatever. But there's a big difference here, because the intellect can know individual objects only indirectly in the phantasms, which means that you don't really, it's like that idea of you can look at a tree, but you don't know what a tree really is. You don't know because you haven't experienced it. You are not a tree, so you don't know what it's like being a tree. And even if you were a tree for a day, how could you articulate that, right? You couldn't do it in human terms. It's just not possible. So there's this idea that really the only thing you can know most directly and reflexively is yourself, your own inner dimensions. And this is something that the mystics of antiquity have realized they realized this thousands of years ago, right? This idea that you can really only know your inner dimensions most directly, and everything else external to that is at best is known indirectly or known as a phantasm, essentially, right? So the word empirical in that previous paragraph is derived from the Greek empirikos, which means to practice or experience without knowledge. Essentially, true knowledge of any individual thing is ultimately an indirect approximation occurring in the mind. We can only make kind of a best guess. What helps the benefit, of course, of language and communication is that we can all use the same language to say that is a tree, and we all know what each other's talking about. Well, even further, this is a maple tree. This is a maple tree that's by the river, by the large stone, by the bridge, and you can make these approximations, right? But knowing exactly what it is in its purest raw form of reality is not possible. It's only possible to know yourself directly. The intellect can know itself most directly, I should say, much more than any other outward object, right? So the only individual exception is the difference between my mind and your mind. One may know their own mind reflexively, which is to say, to bend backward or go into or reflect on one's own self, right? That's the best we can do. This is the only case where we may gain substantially more information than any other area, simply because we cannot go into any other individual being or understand a thing or concept as deeply as ourselves. This is a very important point to understand and to contemplate. The seventh way that language maps to reality. Here's a quote by C.D. Broad. The function of the brain and the nervous system is to protect us from being overwhelmed and confused by this mass of largely useless and otherwise irrelevant knowledge, but shutting out most of what we should otherwise perceive. So in case you're thinking, well, what's the whole point of science and what's the whole point of having an intellect and a mind if you can't even understand what it's like to be a tree, right? If you can't read other people's thoughts, if you can't do this and that. And by the way, there's this promise of tomorrow that someday science will be able to do all of these magical, amazing things. But in my mind, it's until we can solve more basic problems, how the heck are we going to answer? How the heck are we going to really honestly say that we're going to be able to read people's minds and transmit thoughts if we can't even fix much more simpler issues like solving world hunger and pollution and all of these things, right? So in case you're feeling like you're missing out on quite a lot on what's going on in the universe, right? Because we can't directly know anything except maybe our own selves. And even that's slippery at best, right? I'll probably do a whole series on, or at least a video or two on the self and who you are, right? Who are you really? That kind of thing. But we can only can only know that. And really everything else is just an approximation. Well, if you feel like you're missing out on a lot of the universe and what it has to offer, it's because you most certainly are. In a sense. But in another sense, you are part of all of it. So you're not really missing out. But the good news is that if we're aware of everything happening all at once, just take that to its logical conclusion. In this vastly dynamic reality of all, we can't think of it really, but try to imagine all the things going on in like a forest and in like 1 square mile. If you walk into the forest, all the things that are happening in that moment, it's impossible. It would destroy you. It would overwhelm and destroy your mind to think about what the root systems are doing, the trees, the wind blowing, the photosynthesis going on, the animals, bigger animals gobbling up littler animals, and there's there's biochemical exchanges between nutrients, there's fruiting bodies of mycelium growing mushrooms above the ground, and there's all of these biochemical processes happening, and there's all of these co-evolutionary mechanisms happening. There's all of these things happening at once in 1 square mile, right? Just because you don't detect it, just because you don't know it's happening, just because you can't directly observe all these things at once doesn't mean they're happening. We know they're happening. They're unfolding in a very dynamic, powerful way. And to be aware of even just 1 square mile of every possible thing going on in the forest on every level would annihilate you. It would destroy you. So our linear scanning minds, right? This is the key to keep us from just exploding into light energy is our linear scanning minds, the mind that reads and goes line by line. You go word by word, line by line, left to right, left to right, left to right, right? If you read Japanese, you go right to left, right. But we can only go one at a time. You can't you can't put a book on your head and just like you have it all absorbed. But that's how nature does it. That's how nature operates, is everything is doing. There's this doing of everything all at once at the same time, times infinity happening. We can't do that. Our linear minds, we can just do line by line, right? We can only hold one thought at a time. This means our biology is perfectly suited for our survival and reproduction here on this planet. We are certainly growth-oriented as a species, but this knowing of our world, this perception of our world must be doled out in bite-sized chunks. Otherwise, the rapidly accelerating growth of any individual, for example, like if you were to just, like this woman here, right? She is she's a Buddhist monk, right? Quite obviously. And if she were to go from, it's possible. People have had these experiences. They'll have a satori, right? You'll have just an enlightening experience. And then the rest of your life, you have this state. You're in this state. It can happen. But if that happens to you, if you become like this Eckhart Tolle character, you go from Joe Sixpack to Eckhart Tolle the next day, you can be 100% positively assured, guaranteed that your relationships would be destroyed. Everything in your life that you knew as Joe Sixpack would disappear overnight if you turned into an Eckhart Tolle. You woke up in the morning, you walked out of your bedroom, you thought, well, what am I doing all this for? And then you'd start a completely new life, right? So these bite-sized increments, these bite-sized chunks of growth that we experience are important for us. We don't want our entire life we don't want to have to, it's practical not to be enlightened, in the sense that then all of the people around you don't know you anymore, right? And you've grown beyond everyone around you, and it's not that everything and everyone is beneath you. It's not that at all. It's just that you've reached a certain level of understanding where your previous way of life just doesn't make sense to you at all. Just makes no sense, right? So think about trying to understand the world and having everything, even in a square mile of the forest, and much less if you had everything, all of the dynamic actions taking place all at the same instant of the earth thrown at you. I mean, that would probably create a black hole or something. I don't know. But you get what I mean. So these bite-sized increments are important. This linear scanning, this very gradual level of growth, right? So don't be discouraged if you're not growing in an accelerated way. Because if you are, you will see rapid changes, and your life as you know it will fall apart. Okay? So this rapidly accelerated growth of any individual would certainly spell doom for their personal relationships, along with their general health. This is why I think that having at least one vice, for example, is beneficial. Right? Keep yourself grounded by one good vice. Maybe not something incredibly unhealthy or destructive, but have one good vice. Rapid spiritual growth can happen with certain individuals in certain areas. But going from one place to another place in all areas at once, in a dynamic fashion, the way nature does it, right, would likely be very devastating. So love and accept yourself where you are right now, and be happy that you aren't an enlightened being, right? And the way to, it's not really important to understand the 7 ways that language maps to reality. That's of very minimal importance. What is to be understood is that you should really love yourself where you are right now, and understand that you will always, forever, for your entire life, you will always have a little bit of room to grow. And you can do it in a little manageable, fun-sized chunk, right? You can do that, and that's how you're designed to do it. You're not designed to do it all at once anyway, right? So when you look at someone else and their growth and their progress, just realize that they didn't get there by just everything happening all at once as well, right? Otherwise, they risk total annihilation, right? So that's the end of part 18. I do want to suggest that I do want to talk about briefly the limits of human perception and its technological extensions, our scientific extensions of our senses, right? Because all scientific instrumentation really is just an extension of our senses, our sense of our 5 senses, right? So it's just an extension of these different things. But one thing to put in perspective, as far as, like for example, the range of light that exists in the universe, there's a certain light range. We have, on one end of the spectrum, we have gamma rays, X-rays, and then we come across this light ray spectrum. Somewhere in the middle, we have visible light that we can perceive with the human eye, that we can actually interpret, right? And if you go along further along this spectrum, beyond our visible spectrum, you've got things like UV light, infrared light, right? You've got all these different light spectrums. And our scientific instruments can detect, so let's say that this is our light range right here that we can see with the human eye. And then if we go out this way or this way with our instruments, we can kind of detect a little bit more. We can widen to like right here, for example, right? But you have to ask the question, well, how wide do we think this light spectrum actually is versus what we can see and then what we can detect with the technological extensions of our senses, right? Our instruments that we can use to kind of detect what's out there further beyond what the eye can see. We can prove it, but is there anything further than that? Are there light ranges even further? And the answer is yes, it's quite dynamic. So I'll give you an example. This is an example I read from Anthony Peake years and years ago, and it always stuck with me because it's fascinating. He said, in respect to the dynamic range of light, if you were to take the Mississippi River as the length of the light spectrum, and then you were to take a giant reel, just say hypothetically, you could take a giant reel of film and roll it from the north to the south end of the Mississippi River, which is quite a long river, right? If you were to unroll this giant roll of film, how much of that would be the visible spectrum of light, human visible and human detectable with our current instruments, versus how much would be undetectable? And the answer is one frame of that roll, one frame would be human detectable and detectable with our instruments. And the rest of that long-ass reel that was all laid out along the Mississippi River, the rest of that is all of the dynamic ranges of light energy that we haven't been able to detect with even the most cutting-edge instruments. So that gives you an idea of just how much of the universe we actually can detect, and it's okay, right? You have to be okay with that. You have to be okay that we are suited for a certain biology, and we should honor that, right? That's the point. In all of these, in all of our quest for understanding, we don't want to lose sight of the fact that we've been given a wonderful gift with this planet and a wonderful gift of this human experience so that we can come into these bodies and feel and experience. We're not just some ethereal beings of consciousness that don't actually feel. We're very lucky that we get to feel, we get to experience, and part of our growth can happen very incrementally, a little bit at a time, right? But that has its very distinct advantages as well. And also, of course, take comfort in the fact that you're part of this giant, crazy, dynamic, amazing reality that we don't have any hopes at all of really, truly of understanding. But that's okay because we are that. So if you don't try to understand it, if you become it, then in a sense, you already are it, in a sense, right? So it sounds kind of crazy, kind of confusing. But this is the end of part 18. I know there's